Richard Bryant tore into the alien feline's throat with his teeth, its blue blood spraying across his face as he ripped out its jugular and definitively established himself as the apex predator on this hostile alien world. Just hours earlier, Richard's smuggler ship had been blasted out of the sky by a rival gang, sending him crashing down to this uncharted jungle planet. Battered, bleeding, and barely conscious, he pulled himself from the smoldering wreckage. Towering bioluminescent trees and strange chittering creatures surrounded him, the muggy air thick with unfamiliar scents. Richard's marine training kicked in as he hastily dressed his wounds and salvaged what supplies he could: a few ration bars, a med kit, and his trusty plasma pistol. He needed to find shelter and a way to signal for help, but he was stranded on an alien planet with no ship, no comms, and unknown hostiles lurking in the shadows. To survive, Richard would have to become the most dangerous creature in the jungle. A thunderous roar jolted him into action. Suddenly, he was surrounded by snarling, feline-like aliens, fangs bared and claws extended. In a blur of blood and blaster fire, Richard fought for his life, the aliens' superior strength and agility a deadly match for his combat experience and quick thinking. After a desperate struggle, Richard escaped the ambush, leaving several aliens dead or injured. Their fierce leader, Solaris, slashed but alive, retreated into the dense undergrowth. As Richard deeper into the alien jungle, he discovered remnants of ancient ruins, hinting at a lost advanced alien civilization and a sinister secret. Deciphering the runes, a chilling realization hit him. If he couldn't find a way off this planet soon, he wouldn't just die, but some terrible fate would befall the entire galaxy. The stakes couldn't be higher, for Richard and for the future of all sentient life. He had to get this information back to the human colony. The hunt was on. Richard pressed onward through the thick vegetation, slashing through vines and low-hanging branches with his combat knife. The ruins of an ancient structure loomed ahead, its stone walls covered in dense foliage. As he approached the crumbling entrance, he noticed intricate carvings etched into the weathered rock. The carvings depicted a great war between two alien races, the feline Caitians and an insectoid species he didn't recognize. The images showed the Caitians wielding a powerful energy source, using it to drive back the insectoid invaders. Intrigued, Richard ventured into the temple, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous halls. Searching for clues, he discovered a hidden chamber deep within the ruins. In the center of the room, a pulsating crystal hovered above a stone pedestal, bathing the chamber in an eerie blue light. As Richard reached out to touch the crystal, a fierce roar erupted from the temple entrance. Solaris burst into the chamber, flanked by his Caitian warriors. "Step away from the crystal, human," Solaris snarled, his fur bristling with rage. Richard's hand hovered inches from the crystal, his plasma pistol trained on Solaris. "Seems like we've reached an impasse, kitty cat." "That crystal is sacred to our people," Solaris growled. "It's the last remnant of our ancient power, a power we used to defeat the Kilthax invaders long ago." "The Kilthax?" Richard asked, his curiosity piqued. "An insectoid race that sought to conquer our world. We drove them back, but at a great cost. The crystal is all that remains of that victory." Richard lowered his pistol slightly. "Looks like we both have enemies on this planet." Solaris's eyes narrowed. "The crystal is threatened by a rival clan led by the ruthless warlord Zarkul. He seeks to claim its power and rule over all Caitians." Richard considered the situation. An idea formed in his mind. "What if we work together? Your knowledge of the planet, my combat skills, we could protect the crystal and defeat Zarkul." Solaris hesitated, his tail twitching. An alliance with a human unthinkable. "But not impossible," Richard countered. "We both want the same thing, to keep the crystal safe and get rid of Zarkul. I scratch your back, you scratch mine." Solaris grunted, sheathing his claws. "Very well, human. We shall work together for now, but betray us and you'll feel the full wrath of the Caitian people." Richard holstered his pistol, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Wouldn't dream of it, Furball." As they exited the temple, Solaris turned to Richard. We must rally the scattered Cation clans. Only united can we hope to stand against Zarkul's forces. Richard nodded, the weight of the impending war settling upon his shoulders. Lead the way, Solaris. It's time to show this Zarkul what happens when you mess with the wrong human. The trek was treacherous. Richard and Solaris scaled cliffs of jagged stone, trekked across scorching deserts, braved intense electrical storms, and bushwhacked through dense jungles. Along the way, the two warriors fought off packs of vicious alien beasts the size of earth buffalo with razor-sharp tusks. Richard blasted one charging beast after another with his plasma pistol, while Solaris ripped into them with his retractable claws. Blue blood sprayed and bones crunched. When they weren't fighting the hostile fauna, Richard and Solaris had to evade Zarkul's saboteurs, who set traps and ambushes along their route to the other clans. In one harrowing encounter, Zarkul's agents triggered a landslide of boulders, nearly crushing them. Richard tackled Solaris out of the way just in time, the massive rocks missing them by inches. "I owe you my life, Terran," Solaris said, picking himself up and dusting off his fur. Richard smirked. "Let's call it even for that time you saved me from that alien anaconda." As they journeyed on, Solaris shared stories of the Cation's proud history and culture around their nightly campfires. He spoke of their legacy as fierce warriors, bound by a strict code of honor. Richard found himself admiring the Cation's fighting spirit and loyalty to their clans. Solaris also revealed the true nature of the crystal. It was the key to an ancient doomsday weapon from a long-dead alien civilization capable of annihilating entire planets. Richard's blood ran cold at the thought of such destructive power falling into the wrong hands. Over time, Richard and Solaris's initial distrust melted away, forged into a bond of battle-hardened respect and camaraderie. They made an effective team, with Richard's cunning tactics and Solaris's knowledge of the terrain. But their alliance faced its greatest test when they encountered a group of stranded human mercenaries, led by none other than Richard's old nemesis, Commander Alexei Volkov. "Richard Bryant," Volkov called out, a predatory grin on his scarred face. "Fancy meeting you here." Richard aimed his plasma pistol at Volkov, while Solaris bared his fangs and extended his claws. "Easy now," Volkov said, hands raised in mock surrender. "I come bearing a proposition. You see, I've been hired by this Zarkul fellow to retrieve that pretty little crystal you're protecting. Here's the deal. Help me secure the crystal, and I'll guarantee you a first-class ticket back to human space. What do you say, old friend?" Richard hesitated, torn between his loyalty to Solaris and the Cations and his burning desire to return home. He looked to Solaris, then back to Volkov, a bead of sweat trickling down his brow. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a ton of bricks. The fate of this alien world, and perhaps the entire galaxy, hung in the balance. Richard turned to Volkov, his expression grim. "Fine, Alexei. I'll help you get the crystal, but once we're done, you better hold up your end of the bargain." Volkov grinned, his eyes glinting with malice. "Of course, Richard, you have my word." Solaris snarled, his fur bristling with rage. "Bryant, you traitorous scum. You would betray us for this human filth?" Richard avoided Solaris's gaze, his heart heavy with guilt. "I'm sorry, Solaris, but I have to get back home. I don't belong here." Together, Richard and Volkov's mercenaries launched a daring raid on the temple. They battled through hordes of Zarkul's forces, their plasma weapons searing through the enemy ranks. Richard fought with brutal efficiency, his every shot finding its mark. As they reached the crystal chamber, Volkov's men set up a perimeter, holding off Zarkul's reinforcements. Richard and Volkov approached the crystal, its pulsating light casting eerie shadows on the ancient walls. Volkov reached for the crystal, a triumphant sneer on his face. "At last the power to rule the galaxy is mine." Suddenly Volkov's weapon jammed, sparks flying from its overheated barrel. Around them the mercenaries' equipment malfunctioned, their weapons and armor shutting down. Richard smirked, raising his own plasma pistol at Volkov. "Did you really think I'd trust a snake like you, Alexei?" Volkov's eyes widened in realization. "You sabotaged us. You planned this from the start." "Damn right I did," Richard growled. I may be a smuggler, but I've got principles and I don't betray my friends. On cue, Solaris burst into the chamber, flanked by a contingent of Caitian warriors. They had followed Richard and Volkov in secret, waiting for the right moment to strike. Together, Richard and the Caitians fought against Volkov and his crippled mercenaries. The battle was intense, plasma bolts scorching the air and claws rending flesh. Richard fought like a man possessed, his every move a testament to his skill and ferocity. Volkov, cornered and desperate, pulled out a small spherical device from his belt. "If I can't have the crystal, no one can." He activated the device, tossing it towards the crystal. The device detonated, unleashing a blinding flash of energy. The temple shook, cracks spreading across the walls and ceiling. Richard knew he had only seconds to act. He lunged for the crystal, grasping it in his hands. The crystal flared, its energy surging into Richard's body. He screamed as the power coursed through his veins, threatening to tear him apart. With a titanic effort of will, Richard focused the crystal's energy, creating a shimmering barrier around himself and the Caitians. The temple collapsed, tons of rubble crashing down upon them. But Richard's barrier held, the crystal's power shielding them from the destruction. Volkov and his mercenaries were not so lucky, crushed beneath the falling debris. As the dust settled, Richard stood amidst the ruins, his body glowing with the crystal's radiance. Solaris and the Caitians stared at him in awe and fear. Richard had saved them all, but at a terrible cost. The crystal's power was too much for any mortal to contain. He could feel it burning through his body, consuming his very soul. With a final anguished cry, Richard collapsed, the crystal tumbling from his grasp. The temple's remains buried him and the crystal, entombing them both in an eternal embrace. The Caitians clawed frantically through the shattered stone and twisted metal of the collapsed temple, desperate to find Richard. Solaris hefted massive chunks of rubble, tossing them aside like pebbles, his muscles strained, his fur matted with sweat and dust. "Over here," a Caitian warrior shouted. "I found him!" Solaris bounded over, his heart pounding. Richard lay buried beneath a slab of rock, his body broken and bleeding. But as Solaris drew closer, he noticed an eerie blue glow emanating from Richard's wounds. The crystal's energy coursed through Richard's veins, knitting flesh and bone back together. With a groan, Richard opened his eyes, their once brown irises now blazing with azure light. He sat up, the rubble falling away from his body, as if repelled by an invisible force. "What's happening to me?" Richard asked, his voice echoing with an otherworldly resonance. Solaris stared in awe. "The crystal's power, it's bonded with you. You've become something more than human." As Richard stood, the ground trembled beneath his feet. Cracks spiderwebbed across the ruins, and the trees of the alien jungle swayed as if caught in a hurricane. Energy crackled around Richard's body, arcing out in bolts of blue lightning. The Caitians backed away, their fur standing on end. Solaris held his ground, even as a stray bolt singed his whiskers. "Richard, you must control it," Solaris urged. "Focus your mind, will the power to obey." Richard clenched his fists, his face contorted in concentration. Slowly the tremors subsided, and the energy retreated back into his body. He staggered, drained by the effort. Over the following days, as Richard recovered in the Caitian camp, he struggled to master his new abilities. His attempts to harness the crystal's power often ended in disaster, with tents incinerated and weapons melted into slag. The Caitians grew fearful, whispering of the danger Richard posed. Some even called for his exile, lest he bring ruin upon their fragile peace. Solaris found himself torn between his duty to protect his people and his loyalty to the human who had saved them all. He spent long hours with Richard, counseling him on the ways of control and discipline. But their time was cut short by the arrival of a human fleet in orbit, their ships bristling with weapons. News of the battle and the crystal's power had reached Earth, and the human government was determined to claim it for themselves. Richard sensed their approach, the crystal's energy granting him a preternatural awareness. He knew that his presence would only bring more conflict and destruction to the Caitians. In a bittersweet farewell, Richard clasped Solaris's arm, their bond forged in the crucible of war. "I have to leave," Richard said, his voice heavy with regret. "As long as I'm here, your people will never be safe." Solaris nodded, his eyes glistening. "You will always be a friend to the Caitians, Richard Bryant. May your journey lead you to the peace you seek." As Richard's ship breached the atmosphere, the human fleet surrounded him, their weapons locked on. Admiral Graves, a hardened veteran of countless battles, hailed Richard from the flagship. "Richard Bryant, you are hereby ordered to surrender yourself and the crystal to Earth Government Authority," Graves demanded, his voice cold as the void. Richard's eyes blazed with azure fire. "I don't take orders from you, Admiral, not anymore." With a thought, Richard unleashed the full might of the crystal's power. Energy beams lanced out from his ship, slicing through the human vessels like a scythe through wheat. Hulls buckled and exploded, the vacuum of space swallowing the screams of the dying. The human fleet retaliated, their weapons hammering against Richard's shields. But the crystal's energy held fast, turning their attacks back upon them. In mere minutes, the once proud fleet was reduced to drifting wreckage, their crew's bodies frozen in the eternal night. But the victory was short-lived. Richard doubled over in pain, blood trickling from his nose and ears. The strain of wielding such immense power was tearing him apart from the inside out. With a last anguished cry, Richard poured all his remaining strength into a single desperate act. The crystal flared, its light consuming Richard's ship and the shattered remnants of the human fleet. Reality bent and warped, the fabric of space-time twisting into a swirling vortex of light and shadow. The wormhole yawned wide, dragging Richard and the wreckage into its fathomless depths. And then, with a blinding flash, the wormhole collapsed, leaving only the cold, empty void. On the planet's surface, the Caitians watched the sky, their hearts heavy with loss. Solaris raised a clawed hand in salute, a final tribute to the human who had given everything to save them. Under Solaris's leadership, the Caitians began the long, arduous process of rebuilding their civilization. They reclaimed their ruined cities, replanted their scorched fields, and forged new bonds of unity and purpose. And as the years turned to decades, and decades to centuries, the legend of Richard Bryant endured. The Caitians told stories of the human warrior who had become their savior, who had vanished into the stars to protect them from the greed and ambition of his own kind. But even as they honored Richard's sacrifice, they never forgot the glimmer of hope that lingered in their hearts. For deep in the farthest reaches of space, a faint signal pulsed, its origin unknown. A signal that whispered of a man who had touched the infinite, and who might one day return to the world he had saved. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.